So you were just recently hospitalized. How did that happen?
I don't know if I'm even in a position where I've done enough processing to really do this video, but we decided that it was probably best while it's still fresh in my mind or more recent. But what led to the hospitalization? So I guess first off, if you haven't seen the 3 or 4 previous videos on our channel, I was hospitalized recently for a psychotic episode. And I've done a lot of thinking about what led to it or why it happened. And I'm still not totally sure, because in the past, when I've had psychotic episodes, it is, I think, always been because I stopped taking my medications. But that wasn't the case this time. I had been on my medications as prescribed and had been taking them regularly. And so that wasn't what went wrong. At surface level, I got really sick, like head cold sick about 4 weeks ago, a month ago. And I got my period. I have PCOS, polycystic ovary syndrome, so I don't typically get that. So that was probably a big stress on my body. And so perhaps those two, stressors on my body played a role in terms of falling into a psychotic state and struggling more with my schizoaffective disorder. But I think just equating it to that is doing a disservice to the complicated factors that I think were involved in terms of other types of stress. And I think just stress in different facets of my life really led to slipping into a state where I just really didn't feel like myself.
How long had it been since your last hospital visit?
That makes me sad to think about, because I had beat my record of 3 years, and it had been 4 years since I was last hospitalized. I was last hospitalized in 2019, and it's now 2023. I don't know, maybe it's silly to think too much about streaks out of the hospital and stuff, but it felt good that I was on my longest streak of, wellness in terms of not being hospitalized. And so that's been kind of tough. I think someone commented, it's 3 years, now it's 4 years, now it's 5 years. So sure, I'll go for a 5-year stretch. I hope longer than that this time. I don't want to plan for a hospitalization in 5 years even either.
So one of the things that was unique about this hospital experience for you is that you made the decision to go. It wasn't kind of forced upon you. How did you know when it was that you needed to go to the hospital?
This episode was both more difficult and easier because of the fact that I kept kind of bouncing back and forth between having insight into what was going on and not, being kind of lost to the psychotic symptoms. And I say this was more difficult because when I would bounce back to having insight and being aware of how I was losing my grip on reality and how I was behaving and thinking in ways that didn't feel like myself, it felt almost crushing. I would just be kind of bawling and apologizing to you, Rob, and scared, I think, ultimately is what it came down to. When I gained insight, I would be really scared because I knew that I couldn't really trust my mind. And I talked about that in some of the videos where I was documenting this happening. And that's a really scary and difficult thing to experience. The idea of feeling like you can't trust your mind and you can't at any point trust that your experience of what's happening or what you think is happening might not be reality. And wrapping your head around that is really, really difficult because, your reality is real to you. And so to think about the fact that it's warped or shifted or not grounded in the reality that other people are experiencing is really difficult and scary. And so back to the question of why I decided to go to the hospital, I had these periods of insight where I knew that I didn't want this to be happening and I wanted help getting a better grip again on myself and on my understanding of reality. And I think the thing that actually really tipped me to deciding to go to the hospital, even though the hospital historically has been a hugely traumatic place and experience for me, the thing that kind of tipped me over was I was really, really paranoid, and I had never until this point have experienced symptoms around my kids. But the day I decided to go to the hospital, or maybe the night before I decided to go to the hospital, I started having paranoid feelings around my kids. And, that's a really hard thing for me to admit because I think I really, really, really tried to insulate my kids from my illness and protect them through all of this. And, it's never really been a problem before. And so the second that happened, even though it wasn't like anything at all, like I wanted to harm them or I felt they were going to harm me, it was just a little bit of a paranoid inkling that they were on Rob's side, who was conspiring with who knows who, doctors, whatever, out to get me. And there was just that little paranoid inkling around them. And that was kind of what made me realize, okay, I'm not feeling like I can manage this anymore and I need some additional support. And so that was the really big thing that pushed me to be like, okay, I need help managing these symptoms. I need help getting a grip again on my reality. I think, though, that there were also experiences with you that, when I flip back into having insight and kind of being crushed, I felt immense guilt over, because I was thinking and behaving in ways that I would never typically do. And it was ultimately harming you, Rob. And so being able to come into moments of understanding that, I think also was an impetus to realize I need help managing this, because I don't want to harm the people I love. I don't want to not trust the people I love. I don't want to slip into this reality where I'm alone.
So not to drag you through the mud here, but I think it would probably be valuable for people to understand a little bit more about what that experience is like when you're talking about how, you hurt me.
Yeah. So, for example, one instance, probably the worst instance, was I was not grounded in reality. I was in a psychotic state and I was having a hard time. And I used to go off driving when I was in these states, which is probably not the safest thing to do. I'm not condoning that. I'm sorry. I know that. But it's a pull that I have. And so Rob, it was bedtime, and Rob was going upstairs and he said, I'm trusting you. I'm leaving. I'm not going to hide the keys. I'm trusting you. And I don't know, something in my mind took that as a threat or I don't know. I don't know. I can't really rationalize what I was thinking this time because it wasn't rational, and that's the truth of it. And so he went upstairs and I took the keys and I left. And something important to note before this was that I had taken a PRN of an antipsychotic that I have for when I'm needing a little bit of extra medication, I guess. And so it's one that really sedates me. And so I had just taken that and I went off and I drove off. And, jump in here if I'm not telling this right, but Rob got really worried, I think, because I had taken this sedating antipsychotic and I was off driving. And so he was worried for not only my safety, but other people on the road safety. And, it's hard to talk about this because as I am right now and as I can understand the situation, I can identify that the way I acted in this situation was, for all intents and purposes, abusive to my partner, to the person who I love. I ignored his text messages while he was frantically texting me and calling me. I was ignoring him. And I was, kind of blinders on, focused on what I felt I needed to be doing in that moment, and just wasn't really understanding or thinking at all about, or able to comprehend at all the impact it was having on my partner, Rob. And so he got really stressed. All 3 kids were home. And so he couldn't really leave to go look for me or whatever. And so he told me he was going to call the police. And that triggered more paranoia in me. And I just became even more fixated on whatever it was I thought I needed to be doing. And, this is getting longer than it should be. I think important to note, at one point he said, "You can come home and we can forget about this." Or I forget what exactly you said, but I think that was something that reached me in terms of this is getting out of hand and we can make this better by just doing this. But for whatever reason, I didn't. But actually, I started going home. And I don't know, the details of this are fuzzy for me, but I eventually got home and I wouldn't get out of the vehicle. And Rob was outside sitting on the steps and he called the police.
I couldn't get you out of the vehicle and you had the doors locked and you still had the keys. So,
yeah. And so I heard him on the phone with the police, and I didn't want the police to come and take me to the hospital. So I got out of the car and I, in a fit of anger and confusion and altered state of mind, threw the keys across the street and went inside. I think the point of telling this is because what I've shown you guys on the channel has been, partly criticized for, me being relatively put together and articulate about the experience and calm and appearing pretty rational. But there have definitely been periods of this psychotic episode that I haven't put on the internet that have been difficult and painful for both myself and the people who are supporting me, primarily my partner, Rob. And so perhaps normalizing that a bit for other people who are watching, who are supporting someone with this, who are like, well, that's not my experience. No, they're not as agreeable as you are, or they're not as put together or have as much insight as you. There are periods where I really, really, really intensely struggled and put myself and Rob through the ringer.
I still love you very much.
I'm sorry.
But I think that it's valuable for people to, I think a lot of people probably wouldn't guess that would happen or could happen with you, with what you experience. So the day after that, that's when you decided to go to the hospital in the afternoon. And can you kind of talk a little bit about what the like going to the hospital experience is like?
It's kind of fuzzy. I don't remember details, so perhaps you can fill in details, but packed up for the hospital because every other time I've been carted off by police or ambulance unsuspecting, and so I haven't been able to bring, change of clothes and toiletries and stuff that would make a hospital stay more comfortable. But anyway, packed my bag, brought that to the hospital, went to the emergency room, which is not a great place if you're experiencing a mental health crisis. And it's really unfortunate that in order to get mental health services, you need to go through the ER process because it's kind of awful. And they don't prioritize mental health cases. And perhaps rightfully so. If someone comes in bleeding profusely, you need to stop the bleeding ultimately first, or, whatever. But it's just not an environment that's conducive to healing. And it probably exacerbated my symptoms to a degree. We waited to see a doctor for, I think it was like 5 or 6 hours. Finally got in to one of the mental health sectors of the emergency room and spoke with a doctor. And this was getting to be late at night. And he was nice. I didn't mind speaking with him. I felt relatively heard and understood by that interaction. But there were no beds available on the mental health or on any mental health wards in the city. And so I had to stay the night in that ER room. And they didn't give me any meds or anything. Rob had to go home to get my regular meds that I take, just so that I could have something at least, and brought that back to me in the ER. And then he went home to sleep. But again, just being in that environment was really, really, I felt kind of exacerbating my symptoms and making it worse. And I just felt like I wasn't really getting any help. Like no one was really even talking to me. And I was just kind of left to lay there drowning in my symptoms and the psychotic episode that I was experiencing. And, what I was hoping to get from the hospital was meds, like, alternative med changes and stuff to help me pull me out of this. And I wasn't even getting that. And so it was like midday the next day, or perhaps late morning, where I was like, the heck with this, I'm out of here. Like, this is not the help that I need. This is not the help that I wanted or expected or needed, And so I grabbed my stuff and I left. Also important to keep in mind that I was really in an altered state of mind still at this point. And, my psychotic state had gotten worse since being at the hospital. And so I was incredibly paranoid, and I turned off location services on my phone so that Rob couldn't track me or couldn't know where I was. I ordered an Uber to the hospital and lurked and hid around bushes and stuff so that no one could see me or find me or bring me back to the emergency room. And I got the Uber, I booked a hotel, and I took the Uber to the hotel, and I just kind of bunkered down in the hotel, really scared of everyone and everything, and just kind of retreating and hiding. I was really, really scared.
Now might be a good time to talk or begin the story or interject about how your hospital stay went from voluntary to involuntary.
Yeah. So I thought that because I was voluntary, it wouldn't be a big deal for me to leave the hospital. I could do that. I had that right. I went there asking for help. I didn't feel I got it, so I could leave. Turns out that's not really how it played out. And it turns out that the doctor who had seen me the previous night found out that I left the hospital and proceeded to certify me or form me or make me an involuntary patient that needed to be escorted back to the hospital by police. And so I still didn't know that, but they called Rob, and Rob asked them, what was going on, and they told him that. And so, again, I was being not the best partner and not the partner I want to be in terms of putting stress and trauma on Rob, in terms of ignoring his calls, not telling him where I was, because ultimately I was really afraid of him too. And I couldn't understand that I could trust him. You know, it's hard to explain this state of mind to people because it's so far from how I typically am and understand my world and my thoughts and feelings and whatnot. It's so far from that and so foreign and scary. But anyway, I forget how eventually you got me to answer the phone.
I don't remember. I don't remember how I got you to answer. I think actually, well, what happened was I found out where you were.
Right.
Because I checked your credit card statement.
Well, that's how you got it.
Mm-hmm.
Okay.
This is brand new information. I should not have shared that.
How did you get my credit card information?
I got onto your computer.
How do you know my 1Password?
You can just use your finger. My finger on
your finger on I didn't think of that. I thought I was in the clear.
Shouldn't have told you this. This is material for the next incident where I just really won't be able to find you.
So perhaps that's why I answered the phone, because he knew where I was. I mean, I don't remember if you told me.
I didn't tell you first.
Formed.
I went to the place that you were, the hotel, and then I just called you. And I had kind of hoped that I wouldn't need to call the police, that I'd just be able to call you and explain it to you and have you come back to the hospital with me.
Right. I don't remember that. I remember watching you pull up to the hotel, but you still hadn't told me that you knew where I was. But for some reason, I knew you were on your way. And I watched you and I was like, I know you're downstairs. So he came up and we talked and I cried and it was scary. And eventually we decided, well, you decided and I agreed to go back to the hospital. And that, yeah, things kind of continued to be tough in the ER from there. Got back to the hospital. I felt a good chat with a nurse in a nice room. And then was told I had to go spend some time in the isolation room, mental health isolation room in the ER. There's always one of these, I think, where there's cement brick walls. There was a toilet out in the open with a window, just horrific. Metal bed, if you can call it that. I have a lot of trauma in these rooms. And so I was terrified of going back into this room, but they insisted. And so you came in with me and they let me bring a chair to the edge of the room and kind of sit on the periphery edge of the room and just kind of stare at the person who was supposed to be staring at me.
And I took a photo of you, which is exactly the same as the photo of you, because you've done this before at the previous hospitalization, where you get a chair and you sit at the edge of the room. Yeah,
we joke it's now my yearbook photo. 4 years between photos, I would like to point out. But yes, that is something that I do. Anyway, they promised they would get me out and back into the regular, or not regular, but the other mental health room that's less horrific. And probably an hour later, I don't know what it was, they did. They brought me back. I spoke with another psychiatrist, but again, at this point, I was very, very paranoid and not grounded in reality. And so I was very scared of the psychiatrist. I was very combative and I just wanted to leave. And I felt that it had become very hostile from the medical team's perspective. And It just didn't feel like a safe space or a safe place to be. And so I really wanted to leave and they weren't letting me. And I don't know. I just remember them coming in and being like, Lauren, we've escalated your case and you've got a room now. So I suppose if you want to get a bed faster, be the squeaky wheel, be the chaotic patient that they don't want in the ER anymore. That's kind of what did it for me, what got me a room in the psych ward upstairs. So they bring me upstairs. It's like the following night at this point from when I came to the ER. And I don't remember a lot about that. You know, I was pissed off that I was an involuntary patient now again. I was so proud of myself going into the hospital on my own as a voluntary patient, and to have that stripped from me and now be an involuntary patient and being told I couldn't leave felt really violating and really scary. And anyway, they finally gave me medication. They upped my regular dose of antipsychotic and they gave me a PRN of Haldol, which, you know, over the course of several days really did a good job of snapping me out of the psychotic episode and kind of bringing me back.
So I would say that the rest of your hospital stay was kind of uneventful, and we'll kind of get into more details there. But one of the things that was, I think, pretty big for this hospital stay is that our kids came to visit you. Can you talk about that experience?
Yeah. The last time I was in hospital was 2019. I met you and them in 2018. And so we were engaged at that point, but it was still new. And they were young. They were like, what, 4 and 6 sort of thing the first time I was hospitalized. And so they didn't come that time. And I was also perhaps in a worse state the last time too. But anyway, this time they knew I was in the hospital, and I don't know how you guys decided to come visit, but like, how did you talk to them about it?
I mean, they know that you live with mental illness. We talked about how you needed to go to the hospital, but you know, I think there's always a question of trying to keep it like age appropriate, like trying to make it something that they'll understand. And one of the ways that I think, explained it this time was about the food.
I was really paranoid about the food that they were offering me in the hospital, thinking that it was, I say this now and I'm embarrassed, but thinking that there was some sort of mind control agent or something in them that they could control me through, or that they could harm me through, or whatever. And I really spiraled into this delusion around the food and the water at the hospital. And so Rob kindly and other people in my life brought me food from outside that I could feel more comfortable eating, and brought me bottles of water that I felt comfortable consuming. And so I guess you explain that to the kids as being something that I was struggling with, and kind of giving them a bit of a understanding of what one of my symptoms can look like. It was really, really wonderful having them visit in the hospital and, you know, being able to share that side of my life a little bit more.
Normalizing it,
yeah. You know, showing them that this is something that I deal with, and I do need some extra help with it sometimes, but that's okay. You know, I'm still their mom. I still love them incredibly much. I'm still there for them. They can still rely on me. I just also deal with this. And my youngest is 2, so really a lot of this obviously flies over his head, and I'm sure he was just excited to see me, you know, regardless. But the older 2 are now 8 and 10. And so, you know, I could see them thinking about what was happening a little bit more. And since being out of the hospital, my 8-year-old in particular has had questions more questions and has been more curious about my experience and what my illness is. And so I actually talked to him about, he asked me, when were you the most sick? And he asked me questions like, what is it like for you? Like, what do you experience? And so I started to talk to him about some of the symptoms that I experience because of my schizoaffective disorder. And that feels heavy to talk to a kid, an 8-year-old about that. But it also felt really good to be able to be more open and honest about that kind of big part of my life that I haven't hidden from my kids, but I've wanted to kind of shield and protect them from as much as possible. And so having this new space to kind of explore that a little bit in a safe way with them has felt kind of good.
So you went from voluntary to involuntary, and then through another interview with another psychiatrist, your main psychiatrist at the hospital, you went back to voluntary.
Yeah. Well, I don't even think it was that psychiatrist who really, because I think I spoke with his student doctor who was student doctor, came to see me the first day I was in. And I was really emotional talking to her, and I explained to her how I couldn't show up in a meaningful way to receive care with the certification and the form and the involuntary status looming over me, because that made me really clam up and feel like it was a hostile interaction with the hospital medical team and stuff. And it was really impeding my ability to, show up and accept care here. She seemed to understand that and really empathize with that, which I really appreciated. And I think she advocated for me with this psychiatrist to remove the certification, kind of under the understanding that I would stay and accept care, and it would be a more collaborative, nice interaction. And so he did. He agreed to lift the certification, and I agreed to stay and continue with treatment until we both felt that I was in a better place.
Can you talk maybe a bit about the balance between like receiving that care and trying to get to a good enough spot to leave the hospital, but also understanding that the hospital isn't a place where you're going to get to 100%?
Yeah, it's tricky because the psychiatrist kept saying, I want you to feel like you again. And I want you to feel like you when you leave the hospital. But the reality is that the hospital is not a great place to be. There's not a lot to do. You're surrounded by medical teams or other people who are in need of assistance in that period of their journey with their illness. And it's lonely. It's not obviously what your real day-to-day life looks like. And so I think that I was stuck in this place where I'm never going to really feel like me while I'm here. So that's kind of hard to gauge when I'm feeling like me enough to leave the hospital. And so that was kind of tricky to figure out when I felt stable enough to be able to rejoin my regular day-to-day life and not struggle or crumble, under the increased pressures of that. Also, I had a marathon that I was supposed to run in the mountains on the Saturday, and I got discharged on the Wednesday. And I pushed for discharge, I think partly because I really wanted to be able to do that. And I think that has been a big part of this hospitalization and this journey, and has been a big part of the conflict I had with Rob throughout it all, was around capacity and around understanding my own capacity and making decisions in line with respecting that capacity, whether it's whatever it may be. And that's something that I think I really, really struggle with, is being able to acknowledge and understand when my capacity is fluctuating and when it's diminished, and understanding that maybe I can't do everything that I want to do when that capacity is shifting or different or diminished. I didn't end up going to the marathon anyway. And, that challenge has showed up in a lot of other ways too, in terms of needing to better understand my capacity. And that's something that I'm going to be working on for the foreseeable future, is having a more realistic understanding and grasp on my own capacity, because I like to pretend that I don't have schizoaffective disorder. And I like to think that I can live my life the way I would if I didn't have it. And it's hard to come to grips or come to terms with the fact that that's not true. That's not the case. I do have schizoaffective disorder, and it does affect my life in pretty large ways. I often talk about how acceptance is an ongoing journey and a really big part of living with a chronic illness like schizoaffective disorder. And so that too is something that I'm working on, around acceptance.
How did it feel coming home? How have things been?
It's not like you're having a mental health crisis, you're in a psychotic episode and you go to the hospital and it's great. They fix you, you're fine, you can go home and everything is the way it was before. It's not like that. It's a lot more complicated and messy, and it's a lot more of kind of a gradient of wellness. And so a week post-discharge, or, I guess coming home, I was very excited and happy to be home and back with my kids and home with Rob. And that felt really good. But I was still struggling a little bit. And I think also, historically for me, every time I've had a psychotic episode, there's been a subsequent dip in my mood. And I struggle a bit with the depressive side of my bipolar component of my schizoaffective disorder. And so dealing with that a little bit, trying to be proactive in terms of not letting it get to a really bad extent. But yeah, that's kind of where I'm at right now.
What was it like sharing this experience, through the channel as you went through it?
Yeah, so it's kind of interesting that I chose to do that. I think it was possible because I was kind of bouncing back and forth between having insight and being able to understand what was happening with not. And so in those periods of insight is when I recorded videos and shared them on the internet for everyone to see, which felt very vulnerable. And I want to thank everyone who offered support and encouragement throughout it. I read a lot of your comments. I couldn't keep up with all of them, but I read a lot of them, and they really helped me feel less alone throughout the experience. I was really trying to help other people feel less alone in their experiences of navigating psychiatric hospitals and psychotic episodes and that experience. But I really felt that I got that back from you guys in terms of not feeling alone while I was going through that experience as well. So thank you very much for that. I also just want to quickly say that I felt like such a fraud getting ready to film this video, because I was putting on makeup, I was doing my hair, and I haven't done these things. I haven't put on makeup in a good month. And so I think that's something to bear in mind too about this, is that, I got criticized for looking really put together or whatever. I get criticized for my appearance a lot, and understanding that this is not what I typically look like going through this. I'm very aware that I am presenting on camera right now. And so I put in more effort than I typically would to look better. Perhaps just as a bit of a disclaimer that if you don't look this put together or whatever a week post-hospitalization, it's okay. Neither do I. I I'm having a hard time. And so I feel a little bit bad that I cobbled together a look that conveys something else. And so I'm sorry about that. But my own narcissism and vanity led me to try to look put together for this. And so a little disclaimer that it's okay if you're struggling to even take a shower or that kind of thing, because that's where I'm at too.
Okay, so like one final question. Would you go back to the hospital again if you needed to?
He said he had one final question for me to answer so that he could record it. And so I'm assuming this is to show me when I'm like, no, I don't want to go to the hospital in the future. The hospital is not an ideal place to be. And I think that's just the reality. I do think, however, though, that this last hospitalization a week ago or whatever was by far my best experience in the hospital. And I mean, you guys saw the environment. It was pretty nice, and it was a nice place to be, which was a different experience than my past experiences with other psychiatric wards. But it went beyond that. It was more to do with the fact that I wanted help, and I was open and willing to receive that help. And that really changed the dynamic and my experience with the hospital for the better. And so if I can offer any encouragement at all, I think I'm fairly confident in saying this, that medical teams at the hospital are there because they want to help you get better. That's the point of hospitals. And so trusting that and working with your care team to help get you to a place where you want to be is really crucial and beneficial. And I think maybe the crux here is taking ownership over the help you want, need, and deserve, and advocating to receive it, first of all, but then being open to receiving it too, and working with them to take care of yourself and accept help taking care of yourself as best as possible. And that, I think, really is ultimately what led it to be as least traumatic as possible. And so, yes, I would be open to going to the hospital again if my mental health deteriorated to a point again where I felt that I needed that additional support. So thank you for watching this long video. If you did, this is probably kind of the end of this hospitalization series that has become a series. Thank you again to everyone who offered support or words of encouragement throughout it. It meant a lot. It meant a lot to know that I had a community of people who were cheering me on and supporting me through it. And so from the bottom of my heart, thank you very much for that. It meant a lot. I hope that sharing throughout this experience and doing this video, talking about it again and talking about how I felt navigating it, and, talking about these things that often go untalked about. I hope that that has been helpful, because, I even find this really difficult to talk about with people in my own life. I haven't talked this extensively about it with anyone in my life, not even Rob, but definitely not, my family and friends. It's a difficult thing to talk about. And so I hope that by having these conversations on the internet, I hope that it facilitates and opens up space to be able to have these kinds of conversations in your own lives and in my own life. I hope that it's opening the door to make it more okay to talk about these things. One last time, if you have felt alone going through a hospitalization or a psychotic episode or whatever difficulty with your mental health, or if you are currently feeling alone in that, please know that you are not alone. It's just unfortunately something that is difficult and shied away from in terms of conversation that we have. And that's unfortunate, and it's doing a disservice to people who are going through situations like this. And I hope that we collectively become better and more willing to talk about these things, because ultimately it's really just another part of the human experience. And so thank you for listening to this part of my own experience. And I really hope that you feel comfortable opening up about your own experiences like this.